According to reports from several sources close to European diplomatic circles and the US military establishment, the situation around Greenland has in recent days begun to spiral rapidly out of control, moving from a phase of political pressure and economic signaling into what is already being described in closed reports as a pre-crisis stage. It all began with Donald Trump's decision to introduce new trade tariffs, which at first glance looked like a continuation of his familiar protectionist policy, but, upon closer analysis, came to be seen as a tool of direct geopolitical pressure on US allies. Specifically, this involved the introduction of 10% duties on goods from countries that, according to the White House, actively support Denmark in its efforts to retain control over Greenland and prevent a shift in the balance of power in the Arctic. However, those 10% turned out to be largely symbolic, since for key European countries such as Germany, France, Norway, the Netherlands, and several others, the cumulative tariff impact reached 25% when previously imposed restrictions were taken into account. According to economists interviewed by Financial Times and Bloomberg, this represents one of the heaviest trade blows to European industry in recent decades, especially against the backdrop of an already weakened economy and an energy crisis driven by geopolitical instability. The United States remains Europe's main trading partner, and such measures strike not only exporters, but the entire system of transatlantic economic ties that has been built over decades. Nevertheless, as sources in Brussels emphasize, European countries have no intention of making concessions on the Greenland issue, viewing it as a matter of sovereignty, international law, and the future of the collective security system as a whole. Moreover, according to Politico and Der Spiegel, retaliatory measures are already being discussed behind the scenes within the European Union, including symmetrical tariffs on US goods, restrictions on the participation of American companies in infrastructure projects, and even a review of certain military agreements, something that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. Against this backdrop, sources close to the Pentagon claim that Donald Trump held a closed meeting with senior military leadership, during which he ordered the preparation of scenarios for the full and unconditional establishment of control over Greenland. According to insiders, the wording used in these discussions was extremely hardline and left no room for diplomatic interpretation. This was not about negotiations, not about purchasing territory, and not about long-term political pressure, but about a military option that would have to be executable in the shortest possible timeframe if Europe ultimately refused to make concessions. Almost immediately after this, according to satellite monitoring data and reports from open navigation systems, the United States began redeploying naval forces to the North Atlantic. Officially, these movements are explained as routine exercises and force rotations, but intelligence sources claim that the scale and configuration of the deployments go far beyond normal maneuvers. In particular, an increased presence of supply ships, amphibious platforms, and auxiliary vessels has been recorded, assets without which a large-scale operation in Arctic conditions would be impossible. According to a former U.S. Navy officer cited by the Washington Post, such logistics are characteristic not of flag showing, but of preparations for real force deployment. Donald Trump, sources say, is resolute and convinced that control over Greenland is a matter of U.S. national security. In his view, the Arctic is becoming a new key region of global confrontation, and the presence of China and Russia there is seen as an existential threat to American interests. According to insiders, Trump believes that if action is not taken now, Greenland could fall within the sphere of influence of U.S. competitors within a few years, radically altering the strategic balance. However, there is a whole set of restraining factors in this story that make the situation extremely volatile and unpredictable. First, far from everyone in the U.S. military leadership supports this idea. According to sources in the Pentagon, a significant portion of generals and admirals view such a scenario as catastrophic for the entire global security system. The seizure of the territory of a NATO ally would effectively mean the end of the alliance in its current form. NATO, as analysts at the Rand Corporation and the Atlantic Council emphasize, is built on the principle of collective defense and trust. And if the United States were to be the first to use force against an ally, that principle would be irreversibly destroyed. This gives rise to a fundamental question that is already being discussed in closed analytical reports. Are American troops prepared to fire on the forces of NATO countries if they attempt to defend Greenland? A few years ago, this question would have seemed absurd, but today it is being discussed seriously. Second, resistance is also growing within the U.S. political system. A number of congressmen and senators, including representatives of both parties, have already stated in private conversations with journalists that such an order could be deemed illegal, and its execution a violation of the U.S. Constitution. Lawyers and experts in military law stress that the U.S. armed forces are obliged to obey only lawful orders, and an invasion of an allied territory without a declaration of war and without congressional approval sets a dangerous precedent. Third, public opinion is also not on the side of this scenario. According to the latest sociological polls published by reputable U.S. research centers, the majority of American citizens do not support the idea of a military takeover of Greenland and are not willing to enter into a conflict with Europe for control of the island. However, as sources note, Donald Trump in this case demonstrates a willingness to ignore both the views of allies and domestic sentiment, relying on his own vision of history and the role of the United States in the world. He perceives himself as a leader destined to rewrite the rules of the global game, even if the price for that turns out to be extremely high. As a result, the world has found itself in a situation where one of the most resilient security systems in human history has begun to crack. The redeployment of U.S. forces toward Greenland, the trade war with Europe, and the harsh rhetoric from the White House create a sense that humanity is standing on the brink of a new and far more large-scale crisis than anything seen in recent decades. And now all that remains is to watch how events unfold, understanding that any wrong decision, any miscalculation, or excessive confidence in one's own righteousness could trigger a chain reaction whose consequences would be irreversible not only for the United States and Europe, but for the entire world. Some analysts compare the current moment to the late stages of the Cold War, but with one fundamental difference. Back then, there were clear lines of confrontation and established de-escalation mechanisms, whereas today, those lines are blurred and trust between allies has been undermined. If the situation around Greenland continues to develop along the current trajectory, the world may for the first time face a conflict in which the main blow to global stability is delivered not by an adversary of the West, but by the West itself from within, destroying the system it spent decades building. And it is precisely this, in the view of many experts, that makes what is happening especially dangerous, because the consequences of such a crisis would be impossible to localize or quickly bring under control.